Today's episode of Socially Democratic is now available on Patreon. Join our Socially Democratic community for free or for as little as $2.50 a month so you can help support the show. And when you sign up as a campaign organiser, you get access to our premium episodes, a free ticket to a live show, and some of our haters gonna hate and the rest vote Labor merch. Don't forget also that today's episode is also brought to you by Dunn Street. Dunn Street is a campaign agency that specialises in community organising. We only work with people that want to build power to make the world a better place. We develop community engagement strategies to win campaigns both big and small, and we train engagement staff and volunteers in the Marshall Gantz framework of leadership, organising and action. And if you want to create action in your community, then hit us up at dunstreet.com.au. Today's episode is also brought to you by Maurice Blackburn Lawyers. They believe the law should serve everyone and not just those that can afford it. Maurice Blackburn has been fighting for workers' rights in Australia for more than 100 years and have helped more than 500,000 people get the compensation they deserve. So whether you've been injured at work or on the road, you may have a claim through your super. And for expert and empathetic legal support, call Maurice Blackburn Lawyers today. Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Socially Democratic, your weekly centre-left politics and organising podcast that drops every Friday that dives into the progressive campaigns of the day and the people leading them from home and abroad. Today is our last instalment for 2024 of the Feeney Files, also known as the Very Feeney Christmas. It is December, so it's wrapping the year up. So David's going to be on the show today to talk basically about geopolitics and what's going on around the world. Don't forget to follow the podcast by subscribing. I should read the show notes properly. Give us 5 stars on all the things that you do, and support us by joining our Patreon page. And for everything else, follow Socially Democratic on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. All right, let's get to today's episode. Okay, we are taping this one on a Tuesday lunchtime on the lands of the Wurundjeri people. It's December. It's actually December the 10th. I don't know when we're going to put this up, but it's certainly a very Christmassy thematic episode because we're calling a Very Feeney Christmas. It's our final episode with David Feeney for the year. I'm very excited by this. David Feeney, welcome back to Socially Democratic. How are you?
I'm well. I'm a little troubled that you're excited this is the last one. I didn't realise it was such a punishment detail, but a pleasure to be with you.
Yes. So I don't know how we're going to make it Christmassy. I had originally had a question to ask you about Christmas, and in the warm up, you told me that's a dumb question, so we're not doing that. So how do you spend your Christmas, David? What's the plans for Christmas Day in the Feeney Sanger household?
Well, it's the same every year. Which is we are the hosts of Christmas because we have the grandchildren and everyone wants to come and see the grandchildren. So my mother-in-law, Lib's family, and then my own family, which of course includes 4 parents because I wasn't happy with 2. So my parents divorced when I was young and each of them remarried. But none of them had any other children. So we've got a 4-to-1 ratio going on. And if anyone thinks that's great, let me sit down with you and talk you through it. So it's great. It means that my parents, who were, estranged for, the best part of 35 years, now get to catch up every year at my house for Christmas. So it's awesome.
Brilliant. Well, maybe we'll dive into that after Christmas and get a debrief.
We'll see how many questions the viewers send in about that one.
Yeah, exactly. Don't forget to send your questions through to Patreon, and David will answer them for you. Well, speaking of conflict, I thought we would talk about global conflicts today. And it's amazing when you think about it that we've been doing these shows all year and we've never actually kind of gone into this. And it only made me think like a week and a half ago, 2 weeks ago, I thought, what will we do for the final episode with David? I thought, you know what, I'm just going to let him run free in the world of geopolitics and conflict and what all that means. Because I thought like maybe at the start of this month, I was reflecting on the last 12 months and sort of going, okay, this sort of West versus this kind of axis of resistance, which is sort of, Iran and all of their subgroups, plus Russia, China. How has this ebbed and flowed this year in terms of who had the upper hand? And I was then thinking to myself, where are we in this very moment? And then literally a week later, Syria falls, adding more complexity to it. And I was like, okay, we are definitely doing this now. I'm definitely going to get David to come in because even I have lots of questions that I don't know, even reading either the New York Times or the Washington Post are not giving me enough answers. So I want to talk to you about that. And I'm wondering where I was initially going to start in Ukraine, but given the events of the weekend with the fall of the Assad dictatorship that's basically been a family-run business since the 1960s in Syria. Do you want to start in the Middle East, or where would you want to?
Yeah, no, let's start. Syria is complicated, for sure. And it's a conflict I followed with sort of great interest from 2011. And I think it might be the conflict that can lay claim to the unhappy title of being the most destructive conflict of our generation. So the Assad regime has been in place in Syria for the whole of my life. Hafez came to power in a coup in 1971. And then his eldest son, Basil, was killed in a car accident. And so his second son, Bashar, became his heir and successor and took power in 2000, I think.
Correct.
And there was quite a bit of optimism, as there often is in the optimistic hearts of Western leaders, that this generational change might signal some reform in the Assad regime in Syria. Bashar himself had trained in London as an ophthalmologist and done postdoctoral work there. And there was this idea that he was, a softly spoken, mild, westernized person who would perhaps bring a more optimistic turn for Syria. And there were early signs that might be true. He released some political prisoners and he engaged in some economic reforms, opening up what was a very centralised economy. But it was very slow, very haphazard. And all of that turned to dust in 2011 with the Arab Spring, as it's called, where uprisings against dictators sort of spread from Tunisia across to Egypt and Libya, and then ultimately led to convulsions inside Syria. But Syria was different to the rest because Bashar and his inner circle had kind of observed what was going on in other Arab states as dictators were challenged and fell. And he concluded that the best stratagem for regime survival was a brutal crackdown. It's worth mentioning that Syria is a very, very heterogeneous place. It's got lots of different groups inside it, religious, cultural, ethnic groups. And the Assad regime has always been, or had its anchor in the Alawite community, which is about 10% of the Syrian population. And the Alawites are, I guess, best described as a sect or a distinct group within Islam, a little bit perhaps analogous to how Mormons are a distinct sect of Christianity with their own beliefs, but they feel the closest kinship with the Shia, I think. But there were significant Christian communities. There were significant, there are very significant Druze, and there are Kurdish populations, particularly in the east and northeast of the country. And then I think something like 50% of the country were Sunni Muslims. And the economy was very, very dependent on its agricultural sector. It had some oil and some manufacturing, but it was basically It's very dependent on agricultural sector. And so many analysts looking at this war over the last more than a decade now have raised the fact that drought and climate change have devastated the country and exacerbated conflict and exacerbated suffering there. And I think that's an interesting point to reflect on. But in 2011, the civil war kicked off when the Assad regime started mercilessly shooting demonstrators, and eventually those demonstrators organised themselves and started shooting back. And from the very beginning, the opposition was a very diverse miscellany of groups. And whereas the regime was obviously somewhat cohesive, the opposition was made up of several different tendencies. In the early days, one of the significant ones were deserters from the Syrian Arab Army, as a lot of particularly Sunni conscripts, but others sort of deserted from the Syrian Arab Army and joined the revolt. And there were attempts by, and you know, the long arm of the US was involved together with others in trying to create, I guess, a moderate opposition to Assad, an opposition that might embrace some democratic and pluralistic and secular principles. And that became known as the Free Syrian Army. And then in the suburban centres, the revolt happened everywhere, and so there were battles everywhere for control of urban spaces. And it took the Assad regime literally years to consolidate its control over Damascus. And it was really only after about 2015 that it consolidated its control over Aleppo and so in all of these major urban centres there were long-running fights. But I guess an executive summary is that the regime was very clever in categorising its enemies as Islamic fundamentalists and making that characterisation true by releasing a lot of jihadis that it had in custody, and by fueling conflict between rebel groups. And one of the things that paralysed the revolt from early days was vicious infighting in its ranks, as Islamist groups coalesced around a group called Jabhat al-Nusra, which was an al-Qaeda offshoot. And it attracted a lot of foreign fighters into its ranks. It attracted foreign support from countries like Turkey and Qatar. And it turned into the most powerful rebel group. And it spent a significant amount of its time wiping out other rebel groups. And the Free Syrian Army really turned into a dead letter organisation, notwithstanding quality equipment that was sent to it by the CIA and others. It never gained a head of steam, and it was really crushed by a combination of the Islamic rebels and Assad. And then Jabhat al-Nusra had its own split when a significant group of it marched off and formed ISIS and renounced the leadership of al-Qaeda and formed its own caliphate. And of course, we all know what became of ISIS as it swept across the east of Syria. But as the rebel organisations coalesced around Sunni, Salafist, fundamentalist terrorist organisations, this suited Assad very well because it drove a lot of people back into his arms. It chilled a lot of foreign support for the revolt. You might remember Tony Abbott, as Prime Minister, famously said that the civil war in Syria was between baddies and baddies, which was a pretty simple but accurate assessment, I think. And the only group which I think I would argue were clearly not baddies were the Kurds, who were a very sort of unique group in the fight because they came from a Kurdish Marxist tradition, which means that in contrast to all those around them, they supported equality between the sexes, rights for women, had an egalitarian ethos, which of course made them deadly enemies to ISIS and others. And they fought ferociously against ISIS, and with increasing levels of US support, eventually became a powerful force inside the country. As the war proceeded, Jabhat al-Nusra started to gain a head of steam, and sort of by sort of 2015, it was slowly but inexorably moving southward towards Damascus, and it looked like the Assad regime was on the losing end of a long-running military campaign. And that was turned around by the intervention of Russia and an escalation in the support given to the regime by Iran. And what Iran basically did is it ordered Hezbollah, its militia in Syria, to enter the war on Assad's side, and they moved in from Lebanon. And Iran mobilized militias, Shia militias from across the Shia world, but particularly Iraq, but also Afghanistan and other places, and fed them into the fight. And Russia provided special forces and air power. And Russia deploys air power in a way that is completely different to the way Western powers deploy air power. When a Russian plane takes off from an airfield loaded with bombs, it is going to drop those bombs. It is not going to be contacted by somebody on the ground saying, oh, listen, the risk of collateral damage is too great. Don't drop the bombs. Russian air power leveled suburbs and cities in support of the Assad military without regard to civilian losses. So the war kind of entered a new phase. There was a moment where Assad started using chlorine gas on his own civilians to clear out the suburbs in urban warfare. President Obama very famously said if he does that again, it's a red line, and America will intervene in the fight. And Lavrov, the foreign minister for Russia, very cleverly said to the Americans, don't do that. I'll come in and Russia will come in and we will, with the agreement of the Assad government, take all the chemical weapons out of the war. And Obama agreed to that. The Russians then sort of gained some diplomatic kudos for having accomplished that, and Assad ostensibly gave up his chemical weapons. Although, as events showed, he continued to use chlorine gas and barrel bombs. So he clearly didn't give them all up. But nonetheless, that is a famous moment in the war because it's the moment where Obama's red line was, Obama's been mocked with that really ever since. So eventually, Assad and his allies pushed the rebels back and back and back and back in a long, grueling, difficult fight. And the rebels, it looks like the rebels have been smashed. They're driven entirely out of the environs of Damascus and the south of the country. And in the north, they are inexorably pressed back against the Turkish border. At that point, Turkey intervened in support of the rebels, particularly setting up its own sort of proxy rebel force, the Syrian National Army. But Turkey's main interest was in fighting Kurds, not in fighting Assad. And the war kind of ground down to a standstill, and it became what's called a frozen conflict. And the Astana process was set up, where Iran, Russia, and Turkey would negotiate how things moved forward from there. And the frozen conflict basically meant that there was enclaves in the north, which remained in the hands of rebel groups, but that's the only place the rebellion survived. In the rest of the country, there was either the regime or east of the Euphrates, there were the Kurds who continued to enjoy American support. And that's how it's been for years. And everyone kind of reached the conclusion that Assad and his regime had survived through the merciless use of military power and through the support of Hezbollah, Shia militias organised by Iran and Russian air power in particular, and his own regime diehards who, had fought pretty hard too. And so for years, people in the sort of defence and strategic community have kind of chalked that one up as an Assad victory with a very untidy finish. The Arab League reopened its relationship with Assad, brought him back into the fold. Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Jordan all started talking to Assad again. Looked like relations were normalising. It was a big feather in Putin's cap because he demonstrated that Russia was a player in the Middle East, normally just a preserve of American power. It was a feather in the cap of the Iranian regime. They'd saved their mate. And the axis of resistance, that is Iran and its allies across the Middle East, now stretched across Iraq, Syria, and Hezbollah and Lebanon. And so they reached the Mediterranean, and obviously that was trumpeted as a standing strategic threat to Israel. So there we all were. And then, as we know, on the 7th of October, 2023, everything changed when Hamas launched its pogrom against Israel. And that invasion triggered an Israeli response. And I guess, and then Hezbollah in Lebanon said, well, we'll start firing rockets into Israel in support of our Hamas allies. And it appeared that Iran supported these moves and was logistically enabling them across Syria. And then we sort of fast forward to the last few days. Clearly what's happened is the Israelis have successfully smashed Hamas in Gaza so that it's certainly not the force it once was, but perhaps even more dramatically, they smashed Hezbollah in Lebanon with the pages, the exploding pages, the exploding radios, and then a whole range of military moves into southern Lebanon, and of course the targeted assassination of Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah and a very significant figure in this axis of resistance. And so in very short time and in a very surgical way, Hezbollah, a very formidable military force, was wrecked. And it started negotiating with the Israelis really as quickly as practicable. It kept running out of leaders because new leaders would be appointed and then killed, and a new leader would be appointed. But eventually they found someone who could agree that they would withdraw north of the Litani River and stop attacking Israel. And clearly, with hindsight, that military defeat of Hezbollah and the wrecking of its infantry forces in particular meant that a major military pillar of the Assad regime had been ruined. And I would suggest too that surgical attacks by the Israelis on Iranian leaders and infrastructure across the Middle East also served to seriously damage Iranian leadership and control of military forces across Syria. And then we had this extraordinary advance or events of recent times where you could only conclude really that Turkey, who was kind of the only power left standing in support of the remaining rebels in the north, had resourced them to the point where they were again a formidable force. Now, Jabhat al-Nusra, this fundamentalist Salafist al-Qaeda affiliate, had been prevailed on to engage in some brand renovation. So it had changed its name to HTS, Harriet al-Sham, Harriet al-Sham, and its leader, Abu Muhammad al-Jilani, who is a wanted terrorist and who had fought the Americans in Iraq and engaged in as a foreign fighter before returning home and being involved in the rebellion. So this group were, hardcore. They distanced themselves from Al-Qaeda. They said, we're no longer an Al-Qaeda affiliate. We've changed our name. We're going to have a more pluralistic approach. They were very keen to get off the, hate list of America and Western powers because they were struggling to be a force with any legitimacy while they had this terrorist moniker, and Turkey was really the only one who was supporting them. But Turkey obviously supported them effectively, and there was this sudden offensive. Now, they took the city of Aleppo, which, depending on how you count it, is either the largest or the second largest city in Syria, and a city that had been under siege for years and literally took years for the Assad regime to reconquer. They took that city in 48 hours, which was, I thought, breathtaking. Because, I had watched the original fight to capture the city by the regime, and to watch all that undone so quickly was remarkable. And then, of course, we watched the HTS forces sweep south, Homs, Hama, and then eventually into Damascus. And what amazed me was just how quickly the Assad regime, this is a regime that's been at war since 2011. Mm. Its military, obviously, the Syrian Arab army, had obviously just reached the point where it no longer had the will to fight. And where Hezbollah and its Iranian allies were absent. Russia's got a few things on at the moment. Hezbollah is, wrecked on the Litani River. Iran's air defense systems have been crippled by Israel, and suddenly left naked, the regime wasn't willing to fight for itself, and it fell to pieces. And that's remarkable. And in the scramble, the Kurds kind of took over some remaining regime enclaves east of the Euphrates. The southern front of the rebellion kind of reactivated on the Jordanian border and moved north into Damascus. And Jilani and his HTS fighters overran the whole north of the country. So really the regime was left with a sliver of land on the coast, and we still don't know what's become of that. That's where the Alawite community is most densely concentrated, and it's always been described as a regime stronghold. But I was watching imagery of the last few days of those towns erupting in delight as Bashar al-Assad fled the country and tearing down statues of his dad. So that it didn't look like a regime stronghold, So this, as people started to sense that the regime was vulnerable, there was this irresistible move towards the rebels, and here we are. It's an enormous consequential event in the Middle East, because what it means for the here and now is it cripples Iranian credibility, and it cripples its logistical capacity to move support into Hezbollah and organizations like Hamas, who have threatened Israel so diabolically. So it's a great weakening of the axis of resistance. The weakening of Hezbollah has implications for Lebanese politics. What does it mean for Christians and Sunni Lebanese in terms of them regaining control of the destiny of their own country? It's a humiliation for Putin and Russia, because they made so much out of sustaining this regime. We're not like the Americans. We look after our allies, we stick by them, we make sure they win, whereas the Americans cut and run. That was kind of the narrative. That narrative is wrecked. And of course, logistically, Russian naval bases there were important to Russia's power projection, and even more importantly, its air bases there supported Russian activity across Africa, of which there is a lot. The old Wagner Group and various Russian special forces are helping all kinds of dark characters across Africa. And suddenly they are a lot further away from home if they don't have those forward operating bases in Syria. And then what does it mean for Syria itself? Of course, we don't know. It's been very interesting to me to watch Abu Muhammad al-Jawlani making all the right noises. I did notice as his military swept across the country, they did not butcher the Christian or Kurdish or Druze or Alawite communities that they came across, which is the kind of behaviour you used to see, 8, 7, 10 years ago with Jabhat al-Nusra and, of course, ISIS. These organisations famously allowed themselves to get distracted by massacring different religious and ethnic groups. HTS really seem to have avoided that, and as they advanced, they had a message of pluralism. That this is going to be they didn't resolve from the fact that they are an Islamic front, but they also talked about the fact that Syria belonged to everybody and every Syrian deserved protection and peace. So, let's hope that message turns into long-lasting truth on the ground. And what will the new regime look like? And there are so many foreign powers that have had their sticky fingers in the ruin of this country. Turkey, Russia, Iran, Qatar, the Saudis to some extent, Egypt to some extent, Jordan to some extent, the United States to some extent. What are all these players going to do now? Trump has made it very clear, I think, that he says America has no role to play. France may, and others may try and fill that void as a former colonial metropolitan power. But I guess the real hope of the side is that some kind of stable regime comes into being, which is focused on the immense task of rebuilding the country, that it can attract the millions who fled the country, something like 3 million in Turkey, 1 million in Lebanon, 600,000 in Jordan, and millions famously or notoriously moved into Europe. Angela Merkel welcomed 1 million Syrian refugees into Germany. I think there'll be plenty of European politicians and populations hoping that they now avail themselves of the opportunity to go home. That will be an interesting issue going forward. And, that Syria can have a future that now that it doesn't have this sort of dreadfully destructive war. And it's going to have some problematic relationships with its neighbours. Like Iraq has generally been a pro-Iranian state. It has a long border with Syria. Syria and Iraq have always had a difficult relationship going back to Saddam Hussein's days. So an event of enormous consequence, which is, and we don't know how the story is going to end. And we obviously, the Assad regime, its prisons, its oppression, its brutal crackdowns, its massacres, its murders. It has no redeeming features. The only redeeming feature that people did say it had was it was keeping Al Qaeda out of power. Well, it obviously couldn't even do that in the end. So it's going to be a fascinating thing to watch, and fingers and toes crossed that it ends well for the Syrian people.
First of all, that was a 30-minute answer to one question, which was one of the greatest things I've ever seen in a podcast. Easy for me as a host. You started asking your own questions, David, and then answering them, and I'm like, I could literally go and make a cup of tea here. This is fantastic. Second of all, thank you very much for that. It's not easy to summarize the complexities of the nation of Syria and the civil war, and you did that in a very, very methodical way.
We've lost the audience, but you and I enjoyed it.
But you and I are having a great time. A couple of things I will ask a question in a minute about Iran, but a couple of things I want to pick up on some of your reflections there. The first one, our friend, I shouldn't say, I don't know whose friend he is, but Abu Muhammad al-Jawlani, who is the leader of this new rebel group that is...
they're not new, they're just rebranded.
Yeah, rebranded. There was a sort of analysis of him by Colin Clark, who's a counterterrorism analyst
Uh-huh.
based in the US, said Jelani has done an amazing job in rehabilitating his image. He's presented himself as a modern day revolutionary cut from the same cloth as Che Guevara, and it's resonating in many parts of the Middle East and further abroad. However, under his rule, northwestern Syria has still been a harsh place where critics are silenced, tortured, jailed, and disappeared. So there's one.
Just a little bit of context there. He's talking about Idlib province, which is where the rebels were reduced to at their weakest. It's a poor province, and it was stuffed full of people who had fled from the rest of the country to be outside of the government's jurisdiction. And Jelani and his forces spent quite a few years killing all of their political opponents. That doesn't necessarily mean, outspoken and bespectacled civil society. They were killing other militias and other Islamic fundamentalist groups. So, as I said, there's been a characteristic of this war has been a lot of fighting in between rebel groups.
Well,
to give Jelani an excuse, it's just to contextualise it.
No, indeed. And then Robert Ford, the US ambassador, who I think was the US ambassador during the Obama administration, went on to say that that HTS group that he put onto the terrorist list originally, he's now saying that the US State Department should review that because he said that old mate al-Jilani has in that area of Idlib had said that they tolerated Christian practices and allowed Christians to rebuild churches in that region, and because that's where they were governing for large parts of that civil war in terms of what you just spoke about there. So, yeah, I mean, who fills this vacuum is going to be fascinating. I do want to get a sense from you. I mean, you sort of touched on it a little bit before, but like at the start of the year, you're Iran. At the start of this year, you're probably thinking, okay, things are looking good. We ourselves are not in any conflict, but we've got our proxies in the Houthis in Yemen, causing problems for the shipping lanes. We've got obviously a battle going on in Gaza, getting stuck into the Zionists. We've got the Hezbollah in the north, also doing the same. And to your point, we've got this free reign from Iran right across to the Mediterranean where we can arm these proxies for us in the fight against Israel. So things are on the up. Now, for Iran, things aren't looking good. And it's interesting to note that the president of Iran, who's quote unquote seen as a moderate, is now going to UNGA and talking about we need to have diplomatic conversations about what the future looks like. So, I mean, where do you think Iran goes here with the fall of Syria? I mean, are they gonna totally change their tune? And also, does America want to listen? Because Trump's in this isolationist kind of mode, and I just wonder, is there an opportunity here for peace in the Middle East, or some kind of people putting down their weapons actually start talking to each other, or the US going to be like, well, we don't actually care?
Well, I think watching the events in Syria and in Damascus and the flight of Bashar al-Assad, that would have sent a chill up the spine of every dictator around the world, but most especially the Iranians. We know that the Iranian regime is deeply unpopular with swathes of its own people. There's no reason to think that, given the opportunity, they wouldn't all end up, hanging from a lamppost at the hands of their own people if their own domestic systems of repression were effectively challenged. So, like all dictatorships, their first thought will be regime protection. And to make sure that this doesn't trigger a sort of a new Arab Spring and feelings of liberation in other parts of the Middle East and Iran itself. So that's the first thought. And in Lebanon too, where Hezbollah has really been so seriously smashed by the Israelis. And are we going to see Iranian influence there swept away, which I think is a chance. And of course, what these wars do, what these events do, is they distract everybody, appropriately in my view, from Gaza. And the Iranian strategy of transfixing global attention through the sacrifice of its own people, well, of Palestinian people, more particularly, in Gaza, is constantly at risk if there are events more interesting happening in the area, and that's of course true now. And it would be, the cause of Hamas in Gaza might continue to be part of the rhetorical world of Middle Eastern leaders, but it's not their focus now. Their focus now is, whether it's Turkey or Iran or the Saudis or Qatar or Jordan or any of these powers, they're all thinking about Syria and its implications and the wider struggle between Saudi Arabia and Iran for influence in the region. So, yeah, those are my reflections. It's been a diabolically bad 12 months for Iran and its proxies.
Before October 7, there obviously was a lot of discussion between the United States, the Saudis, the Gulf states, and Israel about I guess a three-way alliance or a pact or an agreement. And
that's not quite how the Abraham Accords would mean that a growing number of Arab states would recognise the existence of Israel and bring an end to the notional hostilities that have existed between them. And that recognition was seen as a terrible diplomatic defeat for the Palestinians and the Iranians. I don't think the Saudis or the Emiratis or others would characterise their relationship with Israel thereafter as an alliance. Although the level of covert collaboration between those states would have ramped up very significantly in terms of intelligence sharing and coordination.
Because that's what the Saudis got out of the deal, wasn't it? That they were going to get military support from the United States. And in return, Netanyahu and the Israeli government had to recognise the state of Palestine or start to work towards that. And in return...
Not that last bit.
Isn't that the stumbling block? Wasn't that the stumbling block? That was the thing that the Biden administration was leaning on Netanyahu to say that you need to start to move towards some recognition or formal recognition of the state of or a Palestinian state in order for the Saudis to come on board with this agreement, and then therefore you get security from Arab states in the Gulf and Saudi Arabia.
Well, yes, but that became an addition to the negotiations after the events of October 2023. So the Abraham Accords originally did not require any significant movement on Israel's part vis-a-vis a notional state of Palestine. But it was felt after the 7th of October and the war in Gaza that the Saudis said, well, it's impossible for us to reach these Abraham Accords with you in this context, with Arab opinion so inflamed against Israel. And then it was said, well, one of the ways I think the Saudis themselves might have said, a future state of Palestine and its circumstances must be on the table for us to progress these negotiations. But, the nasty, cynical international realists would say, that resolve isn't going to last because Saudi Arabia wants to get on with its own future.
Yeah, and golf tournaments to sponsor.
They've got gold. They've got cities to build, industries to attract, oil revenues to turn into new industries and new jobs, and that will remain MBS's focus, I think. So the future is grim for Palestinian terrorist organisations.
Let's. You touched on the Russians, and if you're Vlad at this moment in time, how are you thinking about your place in the world? And I want you to start to move into the conflict in Ukraine. Is he just going to see this out? Is he looking for a diplomatic resolution now that Trump's will be in the White House soon? Is he just happy to, like, he's obviously getting support from the North Koreans now in terms of some form of infantry? Like, how long is this Ukraine war going to drag on, do you think?
Well, these events in Syria will have been a very significant blow to him. The prestige of Russia diplomatically and militarily was greatly enhanced by its successes in Syria. And I think it gave the Russian leaders a much vaulted opinion of their own military capabilities.
It sure did.
Which was part of their misjudgment when they launched their overall invasion. So he will be very unhappy camper about all of those hard-won wins having been swept away so very quickly. And he'll be working hard with the new regime and the old Astana process with Turkey and Iran to try and preserve those military bases in Syria. That will be an interesting thing to watch. As to the Ukraine and the war between Ukraine and Russia, I think on the one hand, there is now a deep pessimism across the Ukrainian population and its supporters in Europe and the United States and beyond, that the Ukraine war is going to end in a Ukrainian victory. And I think that...
Did you say a Ukrainian victory?
A Ukrainian victory. There's deep pessimism about that being possible.
Oh, sorry. There's pessimism that they're going to get it resolved. Yep, sorry.
Yeah. And once the Ukrainian counteroffensive in the summer and fall of 2023 failed, the war really has devolved into a fight between a sort of a far more set piece and brutal war of without much manoeuvre, where Russia's willingness to spend more human life and consume its resources has meant that it's just enjoyed a continuing advantage over the Ukrainians. And of course, the Ukrainian resistance is so dependent on foreign aid. And for long months, that foreign aid was held up in the Congress by the Republicans, and the Ukrainians were starved of resources at a critical time. Very few European states have kept all of their commitments or have stepped up to the plate in terms of providing Ukraine with the resources it needs. And Ukraine itself has struggled with manpower through its own conscription systems to replenish its ranks at the front line. And so the Ukrainian military is starved of resources and exhausted and slowly, very slowly, being pushed back. Now, there was a sort of a flurry of excitement when some sort of mechanized and mobile elements overran parts of the Kursk province inside Russia. And, the Ukrainians have just been absolutely stunning in terms of their ability to adapt and innovate and take their enemy by surprise, to build weapons and systems that can defend it from missile attack. And they've driven the Russian Navy out of the Black Sea, and they don't have a navy of their own. They've successfully paralyzed the Russian Air Force, which is much, much greater than its own. They are now engaging in counter salvos of ballistic missiles and drones with Russia. So I'm not taking anything away from Zelensky and the Ukrainians, but the Russians have just been prepared to use its numerical advantages without any regard to the suffering of their own people, and they have slowly pressed forward. So where does that leave us? It leaves Putin with a sense, I guess, that on the one hand, as long as he's willing to continue to pay that price, he can expect his forces to slowly but inexorably continue advancing. But he will be concerned that those losses mean that there are Russian families and Russian communities who are desperately aggrieved, and that might start joining up into hostility towards the regime, as it did a little bit in Afghanistan during the war in Afghanistan in the 1980s. He'll be concerned about the example of Bashar al-Assad, that regimes, fall quickly and sometimes very unexpectedly. And he will be concerned about whether now is a good time for him to sort of cut and run with. So there'll be that equation playing in his head. And then for the Ukrainians, there's the very bitter thought that they can't win militarily and they need to do a deal, end the war, rebuild their country, and create the diplomatic infrastructure so that it can't be attacked so recklessly and viciously into the future. So how does that possibly happen? Who the hell knows what Trump will do? Trump has, of course, boasted that he's going to sort this out very quickly and he'll probably sort it out before an inauguration day, which you'd have to say at this point is a boast he can't keep. Mm. But he might find himself in a position where he can force them to the table. He can force Putin to the table by saying, if you don't come to the table for good faith negotiations, I'm going to arm the Ukrainians like you've never seen. It's going to be great. It's going to be amazing. I'm going to do it better than anybody's ever done it. And conversely, he can force the Ukrainians to the table by saying, I'm going to stop arming you. Mm. And then what kind of deal might be cut? Well, I don't think there's any realistic prospect that Russia's going to lose the Crimea. Perhaps Ukraine surrenders the Donbass, but keeps provinces like Zaporizhia, and then gets some serious undertakings about how it's going to be supported if it's attacked again. I don't think it's feasible for it to join NATO at this moment, and that. But obviously, going forward, it's going to have its borders guaranteed by other powers. So it's possible to see how that comes together. It's a bitter pill for Zelensky and the Ukrainians to surrender territory to such a belligerent, but it might be the realpolitik. And of course, for Putin, it means he can end the war and say, I've denazified. I've saved the Russian people of the Donbass. He might be able to use his totalitarian powers of communication to persuade his own people that it's something other than an abject defeat. But, let's be clear, it's an abject defeat. I mean, his strategic goals when he opened this war was a quick victory against Ukraine. He's suffered unbelievable losses. The Russian people have suffered unbelievable losses. The Warsaw Pact's inheritance of thousands of tanks and armoured vehicles has now been smashed up across the Ukraine. And the joke is that Russia used to say it was, the largest military in the world and the best military in the world. And now it's not even the best military in the Ukraine.
And I think,
I guess going forward, Putin has a future where he's got to rebuild his economy from sanctions and contemplate a future as a Chinese vassal state.
Great segue, because that's what I was about to ask you. I think you probably you probably refer the Russians now as a shelf company for the Chinese, but a vassal state's what you're going with, and that's what we'll stick with. So to China, let's talk about China then, and where they're sitting in this moment. I read somewhere that, and I don't know whether this is true or not, but 2025 was the target year that China wanted Taiwan to come back into,
2027.
Oh, was it 2027? I certainly was ready 2025. Someone's then obviously made a mistake there in that article. I'll go find them and tell them off. Because then I was thinking, oh shit, that's next year. That's next year. That has serious consequences. Are we paying attention to that? Okay, so we've got 2 years up our sleeves, but nonetheless,
tons of time. Exactly.
I think my point stands.
Australia's defence procurement system can manage that, no trouble.
Yeah. Where are we? How are we expecting? Where's China in all of this? They're obviously looking at what's happening with Russia. They were probably happy at the start with the way that the Russians were conducting themselves in against the West. They're probably happy with a bit of the stuff going on in the Middle East because that was going well against the Americans. But if our theory is now that, no, these things aren't doing very well, China's probably like going, we bought stock in bloody the Gregory's maps and turns out that this isn't a good idea because now Google Maps. Like, how are they feeling about it? Because obviously that would, if we're seeing that the West were preoccupied with stuff that was happening in the Ukraine or in the Middle East, maybe that was an opportunity for them to say, oi, Taiwan, time for the one China policy. But are they going to be revisiting that now? I'm just interested to get your thoughts about how China is sort of flexing its muscle in the sort of the Pacific Rim.
Yeah, well, now we're engaging in wild speculation because I don't pretend to comprehend how the President Xi and the regime there make their decisions. I don't think China would have been happy at all with international events over the last couple of years. I think they would have. The Russians invaded Ukraine without conferring with them first. They wouldn't have been thrilled about that. But even worse, in those early months of the Russian invasion in the Ukraine, Russia suffered devastating defeats. Some of its greatest losses in the whole war were suffered in those early moments of the war. And, Putin was handed his ass and sent scurrying back across the border. It was an abject defeat and humiliation. And so while China might have gained some small measure of satisfaction from the fact that sanctions rendered Russia desperate to sell it energy cheaply, it wouldn't have been thrilled with the fact that its northern partner had just demonstrated how militarily inept it was. And similarly, with the Middle East, China does not yet seek to exert its influence or shape events in the Middle East to a great extent. It's probably, but it has an enormous reliance on Middle Eastern energy exports. But it lets America pay the price for policing the sea lanes and maintaining some level of strategic stability in that region. It hasn't stood up and tried to do that itself. And I don't think it would have been thrilled to see events in the Middle East pan out the way they have. A dictator gone. China doesn't like the fall of dictators. Its foreign stance is always that countries are sovereign. We should stop lecturing each other about about international and humanitarian values, and dictators should be allowed to roam free. So I don't think it will have been happy with these developments either. The idea of 2027 is, as far as I can tell, a US assessment of strategic guidance given by the Chinese regime to its own military, and that President Xi constantly exhorts his own military forces to be ready. And of course, there's a very significant military build-up going on in China and has been now for many, many years. China builds the equivalent of the French Navy every 4 years. It's restructured its military so as to try and make them more joint, more cooperative, more effective. And of course, Taiwan is the epicenter of everyone's anxiety, quite reasonably. And so what does this now mean looking forward? I think, notwithstanding Trump's isolationist, instincts, and notwithstanding the fact that such an important part of the MAGA rhetoric is, we're anti-war, the Democrats are the pro-war party, we're the party that wants to get out of foreign entanglements. I think for MAGA, China is an exception. And we've seen MAGA, for instance, even when they're letting everybody down on Ukraine, still maintain its rhetoric about China being the global competitor and the threat to freedom, without any awareness of the linkage between those two fights. But don't start me. So I think what that means is that under Trump, America will stand firm on Taiwan and on any challenge from China, because that's part of its own self-identity as a political movement. And holding together an alliance, a concert of powers that includes Japan, perhaps South Korea, Australia, perhaps to some extent India, as a concert of powers that can deter Chinese adventurism and militarism, I think is the hope of the side. And we always need to remember that, you know, if you're sitting inside the regime in Beijing and you're looking at your top 10 challenges, you know, challenge number one, we govern 1.4 billion people. Depending on how you calculate it, we have the largest or second largest economy in the world. And so job number one is running all of that. And job number two is concerns about the Chinese economy, and then concerns about Chinese demography. They've got territorial challenges on its border with India. They have fraught relationships around the South China Sea with Vietnam and the Philippines. But they've got a big menu of jobs and issues and challenges confronting them. So when 2027 rolls around and President Xi looks at the calendar and says, okay, let's do a recheck, we want at that moment deterrence to prevail, and the idea that the Taiwanese and the alliance structures around it make it too hard, too dangerous for any responsible president of China to, you know, put everything on black, because there's too much at stake for a Chinese regime. And, you know, depending on who you talk to, China might be at the peak of its powers about now, and its future with slower growth, demographic challenge.
Aging economy.
Its challenges are in front of it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I want to leave it there, and I want to do a wrap up of the year because we're at an hour. David, thank you for all of that. That was fascinating. I'm sure our listeners that are still with us are enthralled as well. I've got a couple of things I want to wrap up for the year in terms of domestic politics. My first question actually is, so we'll do sort of best government, worst opposition, politician of the year, campaign of the year. But actually, I've got one question for you. Heading to 2025, do you want to be the campaign manager for the Albanese Labor government, or do you want to be the campaign manager for the Dutton opposition? It doesn't matter. You're a gun for hire. Which team do you want to pick in terms of winning an election?
Oh, that's an evil question. I can't divorce myself from my Labor partisanship. I mean, I would humbly submit that both of them are significant professional challenges. I mean, obviously, if one was constructing Dutton's campaign, you've got your inner city teal challenge versus your full-scale pelt against Labor in the outer suburbs challenge. But you can see what he's doing with, hugging the Israeli community, hugging the Australian Jewish community, hugging the immigration concerns. You know, there's lots of international examples of what to do, and I think he's doing them. So I think that's formidable. Fewer international examples about what Albo should do, maybe some international examples about what not to do. That can help. No, I can't surrender my Labor branding and give you a real answer.
When do you think the election's going to be?
I think they'll go for as long as possible. They'll say that that's a virtuous thing to do because people like governments to run full term. I think they'll do it because of interest rates, because of pressure on the budget, and because the polls are particularly shitful at the moment. Labor's primary vote, according to the Resolve Monitor, is down to 27%, Coalition 38%. 2PP, I think, was 51-49 against us. But gee whiz, winning a federal election with a primary vote of 27, the golden rule is you call an election when you think you can win. I think that means you don't call it anytime soon.
Who's been the best government of 2024? State or federal? Or even around the world?
Well, I think we'd have to say Malinauskas and South Australia. A beacon of reason, stability, good government, new ideas, fabulous.
You can take the boy out of Mercedes College, but you can't take Mercedes College out of the boy.
There's just something about Mercedes College graduates. They're smarter, they're better, they're stronger. Yeah.
Worst opposition. I actually had the Malnouse's government as well, to be fair. Worst opposition of 2024.
Well, there's always a synergy, isn't there, between good governments and terrible oppositions? So I would say the worst opposition has got to be the Liberal Party in South Australia. The leader of the opposition in South Australia, David Spears, not to be confused with the journalist of that name.
I know, how's that?
Found himself, well, allegedly found himself
Correct.
being filmed lining up some lines of cocaine for a big afternoon. And when that footage became public, he earnestly sought to persuade the good burghers of South Australia that it was a fake, deep fake piece of film produced by his political enemies. Very sophisticated political attack, you've got to say.
Indeed.
For David Spears to be targeted by those sorts of capabilities would make you think that we're talking about an international conspiracy here. Nonetheless, he was dissatisfied with the number of people who believed him and resigned as leader of the opposition, forcing a by-election in his seat, which the Liberal Party then lost with a swing of 20%. That is not a mistake. You heard it, 20%.
Yes.
So in the history of South Australia, an opposition, a government has only won a by-election twice in the history of the state, and they were both this year when by-elections were won from the opposition by the government. Incredible.
Politician of the year.
Now, this is a little trickier, but I would like to nominate Isaac Herzog, the president of Israel, who I think has done an outstanding job in offering a different face and a different narrative on key moments from his Prime Minister Netanyahu, and being a unifying and compassionate figure, but also a very strong voice for Israel, and a strong advocate for Israel's right to defend itself against the gravest of situations. So I'm going with Isaac Herzog.
I've got a little story about Isaac Herzog. When I was still working for the Labor Party and we had a podcast called Pot on the Hill, RIP, he was out in Australia for something. And I don't think he was the president yet then. I think he worked for one of the international jury organisations, and he was doing his sort of diplomatic and cultural work for them. And so I managed to snag an interview with him. And we talked about Israel. We talked about the diaspora. We talked about the challenges that Israel face. You know, he's a moderate. He's a former Labor Party leader. We talked about Labor. We talked about the kibbutz movement. We talked about everything. It was great. I had a great conversation with him. And at the end of the interview, when we're packing up, he said to me, because he'd obviously done a lot of media in the days leading up to it, Australian media, and he said, I can't do an Israeli accent, but Stephen, finally, a decent interview with proper thought-provoking questions. Your ABC journalists obsessed with some trivialities of Israel and picking on blah, 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 blah. Like he obviously had it up to fucking here.
Yeah.
With, everything. But
with the pro-Hamas ABC.
Yeah, yes. Like he was just done. He was done. And I think at the start of the interview, he was thinking like, what is this going to be like? But by the end, he opened up and like it was a really good chat, talking about all the no nation is perfect by any stretch of the imagination. And it was an honest and frank conversation with him. And I really enjoyed it. Yes, but to your point, he has certainly tried to present a different narrative to that of the actual Israeli government in the last year. Okay, last one, campaign or campaigner of the year. And then we'll close it out.
Well, this is unhappy, isn't it? But because I think I've got to give it to Susie Wiles, the co-campaign manager, I think the preeminent campaign manager for Donald Trump's 2024 presidential campaign, and a woman was recently named as his who will be the chief of staff to his presidency. Interestingly enough, the first woman to ever hold that post in the United States, a very formidable operator from Florida, who obviously ran a campaign that enjoyed enormous success across the United States of America, with a budget that was about half that of her Democratic adversaries. So a Jedi Knight for the forces of darkness, Stephen. Very formidable operator, Susie Wiles. There was a brief moment, I don't know if you remember this, when Trump was on stage claiming victory on election night with his vast entourage around him. And he called Susie Wiles to the microphone and said, his vice president, J.D. Vance, had said some words, and a couple of others had said some words. And he said, Susie, come on, Susie, come up and say some words. You're the campaign director for this enormously successful campaign. And she had to be virtually pushed to the front. She really didn't want to. And when she finally got near the microphone, she just flat out refused to say anything and disappeared back into the wings. And there was a part of me that just had a lot of professional admiration. Important strategic advisors are to be neither seen nor but and only heard in private. And you don't make yourself the story. And campaign directors understand that they are not media figures. And where you and I both Labor campaign veterans, we understand that ethos. And at that moment, there's a lot of campaign directors who would have grabbed that microphone and made themselves the most famous campaign directors in the history of politics, having just elected a president. And she stuck to the creed and refused to speak. So
there we go.
There you go.
David Feeney, thank you so much. Not just for today's episode, but thank you so much for your contribution to Socially Democratic over the last 12 months. It's been a ride. I've enjoyed both your intellect and insight and also your comradeship over the last 12 months with all of our episodes of the Feeney Files. It's been a lot of fun. And I know certainly the feedback that I've got for our 7 listeners that have said they've enjoyed every episode as well.
Right. Thanks, Mum.
It's a tribute to what you bring to the show. So we want to wish you and the family a very happy, safe, and holy Christmas. I'm sure Christmas Day will be a lot of fun with you and all of the relatives, and I hope you have a good break over the new year as well.
Looking forward to it. Thank you very much, and you have a great break. Thank you.
Hey there. Thanks for listening to Socially Democratic. Did you like the podcast? Hit the follow or subscribe button and be sure to leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Podchaser. And to get all the latest updates on Socially Democratic, follow Dunn Street on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And we'll see you next Friday.